These are two common human experiences. People will offend us, and we are people who will, in one way or another, offend others. If you haven't read our reading for today, I deeply encourage you to do that, just because it's such a wonderful, wonderful story. But whether you have or haven't, please allow me to recap it for us before we get into any more detail. So David and his men are out in the Judean wilderness, hiding from the jealous, unpredictable King Saul, who wants David dead. Even when you're not being hunted by the king of Israel, the wilderness is a dangerous place. There's severe weather, there are wild animals, and there are bandits. Centuries after David, Jesus would tell that famous story about a group of bandits who attacked a man in this very same wilderness, and who was then helped by a man we know as the Good Samaritan. And bandits would prey not only on travelers, but on people who made their living in the wilderness, like shepherds. And shepherds were easy pickings because they had large herds to manage, and so you could imagine people coming stealing stock, or whether they came and stole from the shepherds themselves. Either way, it was a dangerous business to be out in the wilderness. So whilst David and his men are in the wilderness hiding out from Saul, they become their own kind of Good Samaritans, precursors to the later Samaritan. And they offer then, without being asked, they make themselves available to protect the shepherds and their herds from the gangs that were robbing in the area. It actually reminded me of the story that in our own local newspaper in this past week, some of the paramedics in our city are asking the police to go with them into certain areas because they simply don't feel safe. And so David was doing a bit of that. David and his men become kind of a neighborhood watch crossed with a security company. And as you can imagine, it's why the wilderness is called the wilderness, is there's very little comfort in the wilderness. There are only the bare necessities, no luxuries, no indulgences. And so in this season, there's a festive season. We're not told the nature of the festive season. We just know there is a festive season. Just think of Christmas for us, for example. David decides to send 10 of his men to Nabal, who's a wealthy man whose flocks David has been protecting. And he tells his men to ask if he and his men could come and join one of the festive banquets that Nabal will be hosting, so that they could have some good Middle Eastern hospitality and good food and some comfort for a change. And David actually expected a warm welcome, filled with gratitude for all the kindness that he and his men had offered to Nabal and his workers and his sheep. In many ways, Nabal only has a business because of David's kindness. But instead, Nabal pretends that he has no idea who David is. And even more than that, he then accuses David and his men of being runaway servants, which was a common thing, but of being runaway servants who have abandoned their master. And so he wants nothing to do with David or his men, and so he rejects David's request to join the banquet and have a decent meal. David is enraged. He's enraged. And the other thing we know about David, it's in fact why he's on the run from Saul, because Saul is jealous of this. But David is a skilled and an accomplished soldier. I don't know if any of you have ever watched the rather violent movie The Equalizer. It's got 2 sequels, I think. But Robert McCall is the main character, and he exacts often cruel revenge on badly behaved people. And now David has the killing skills of Robert McCall. And so if you know those movies, you will know if this was an Equalizer movie, Nabal is as good as dead. The question is just when it will happen. But anyway, word gets back to Abigail, Nabal's beautiful wife. We're told that she's beautiful. And word gets back to tell her that the Equalizer is on his way. And so she does a few significant things, all of which for our purposes today, we're going to sum up as saying that Abigail interrupts David's rage with beauty. Abigail interrupts David's rage with beauty. And so it's Abigail's life which will teach us today about offending and being offended. Now, the thing that I really wanted to guard against today, and I want to ask if you'd understand this with me, is I wanted to avoid this being a how-to sermon, partly because I'm so moved by the story, and I think the story on its own speaks. You barely need my help. And so all I want to do is, rather than do a how-to sermon, in a sense, just almost like with a torch, I just want to shine on some spots in the story And I hope that you will put this together for your own life rather than me trying to suggest particular ways in which it needs to apply to your life. So let me shine the torch on three things. Firstly, let me notice that Abigail interrupts David's rage, not just with generalized beauty, but with the beauty of her life. She interrupts David's rage with the beauty of her own life. Abigail, as we are told, is blessed with natural beauty, but really the far greater beauty of her life is what happens inside of her. If you were cynical and you read the story, you might say that all she was doing was craftily begging for her life or negotiating to protect her own life. But I think if we read the story carefully, we will see that it's not actually her life that she's fighting for, although there is a bit of that. But what motivates her is to protect someone else's life and not her own. So firstly, what she does in the story is she greets David with humility. She doesn't confront him. She postures herself. She falls on her face before him. She humbles herself before him. Too many of us underestimate the simple power of humility, especially in provocative environments, the simple power of humility. C.S. Lewis says, pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. It's important insight. Pride leads to every other vice. He suggests that if we want to find out how proud we are, we just need to consider how easily we are offended. If we're offended if we don't get our own way in a situation, if we feel snubbed, I think even in restaurants, if the waitress doesn't come soon enough to help us, or the food isn't exactly as we want it, or if we don't get enough attention in social environments, we're sitting at a party or in a group of friends and not enough attention, or if others show off, does it rub us up the wrong way? There are different ways for us. Just pay attention to yourself, as C.S. Lewis suggests, because we will notice that most of us are not pride-free. We all have measures of pride in our hearts. And again, Lewis goes on to say that pride is essentially competitive. And so when we are offended, offense is really my pride bumping into your pride. And so it was Nabal's pride which made him dismiss David's request, and it's David's pride which makes him seek revenge. Abigail's first action in the midst of all of this raging pride, she knows that the way that we dissolve this thing is where there are these great expressions of pride, she enters with humility. C.S. Lewis again says, nearly all those evils in the world which people put down to greed or selfishness are really far more the result of pride. And I thought this was very significant. He says pride always means enmity. And then he qualifies it and says it is enmity. It's hostility. Wherever pride is present, there is hostility present. So you can be certain, for example, that the heartbreaking, unconscionable war in Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and Russia, for that matter, these are matters of pride. They are vast international issues, but the source of them is human pride. And so Abigail responds to an offense, responds to a prideful offense with gentle humility. The second light I want to share in this story is that Abigail makes right. I wasn't sure exactly how I should title this second observation, but I settled on that. Abigail makes right. She points out to David that she never knew of his original request. The request to join the banquet had never come to her. So it's not that now her life is in danger, that she suddenly relented and changed her mind and is happy to change things. She was never a part of all of this, and she wants him to know that. Her husband, she says, whose name means fool, is indeed the fool that his name labels him as. And we know that in those days, women didn't get to choose so much who they married, but you kind of think, man, can you imagine marrying a guy whose name is fool? You've got a pretty good sense, I think, of what your life might be like. But nevertheless, Abigail risks her own life on behalf of this fool, or as a result of this fool's behavior. And that really makes her both courageous and wise in the way she intervenes. Because it's always costly to be a peacemaker, to put yourself as the person in the middle. The peacemaker always runs the risk of being taken out from both sides. And it is significant for me in this story that Abigail never tries to defend the behavior of her husband. She describes him as wicked, and she says that he entirely lives up to his name. He is a fool. And so her peacemaking, for me this is important, her peacemaking does not condone the behavior of the offender. In world politics, there's a temptation for people to say, in the divisive political environments, people say, oh, they're good people on both sides. What we sometimes miss is that there genuinely are, because I know what people mean by that, but there genuinely are people who are authentically wicked. And Abigail sees the wickedness in her husband. Her husband was foolish and wrong. But Abigail understands, as bad as his behavior is, peace is always better than war. Always. Peace is always better than war. Always. No one wins in war, whether it's between nations or between people. Peace, and when I say peace, I mean proper peace, not pretend peace. Peace is always better than war. And so for the sake of peace, Abigail offers David and his men what really rightfully they deserve. In other words, she makes right. She restores. She offers them a generous banquet of thanks for all that they have done. And I want us to notice this. It is by making right that Abigail is the bringer of peace. And there are many people who want peace without making right. They want peace without repentance. But Abigail, on behalf of her husband, intervenes to make right. Then there's a third and final thing I want to shine a torch on today, and that is Abigail speaks a blessing. Abigail speaks a blessing. And I don't want to sound too schmaltzy in this. I just reflect some of my own. I've spent some time in the story this week, and I am just deeply moved by how beautiful Abigail is in this moment. She speaks this blessing over David's life. Some people, perhaps in more charismatic churches, might call this a prophecy, a word from the Lord. I don't care what you call it, it's a blessing. And I decided instead of using from the NIV, I chose to use the words from the Message. And so this is what she says to David. So when you hear the word my master, she's talking to David, not about her husband. She says, forgive my presumption of coming to you, but God is at work in my master. God is at work in you, David. Developing a rule, solid and dependable. My master fights God's battles, not his own battles. This is for God. And as long as you live, no evil will stick to you. If anyone stands in your way, if anyone tries to get you out of the way, know this: your God-honored life is tightly bound in the bundle of God-protected life. Think of a bale of straw perhaps that gets wrapped in the middle. You know that picture. If anyone stands in your way, if anyone tries to get you out of the way, know this: your God-honored life is tightly bound in the bundle of God-protected life. And she's going to qualify that in a moment. She says, but the lives of your enemies will be hurled aside as a stone is thrown from a sling. And then she concludes her blessing in this way. She says, when God completes all the goodness he has promised you and sets you up as a prince over Israel, you will not have this dead weight in your heart. You will not have the guilt of an avenging murder. And then when God has worked things for good for you, won't you please remember me? Because her life has been terrible. When God completes all the goodness he has promised, you will not have this dead weight in your heart. You will not have the guilt of an avenging murder. In other words, God has so many good things stored up for you, David. Don't go and tarnish them now. Don't go and harm them for the sake of this one hot-headed, even if it's understandable, don't go and tarnish them for the sake of this one hot-headed act of vengeance. So Abigail really pulls David from his bloodlust, from his desire for revenge. And the reason she does it, she doesn't just pull him back from it, but the reason she does it is she enables him to see himself as God sees him. She reminds him that his life is bound to God's. She saves his life. More than her own, she saves his life. And it's notable for me that she doesn't, as the popular saying goes, it's not so much that she's calling goodness out of David, even though she might be doing that. But that's not what she does. What she does, instead of trying to call something out of David, she speaks goodness into David. And I think that's a critical difference. It's not like she's trying to awaken some innate goodness in David. It's more like she's speaking God's blessing into David and speaks God's good purposes into his life and for his life. She's pleading with him, don't allow this one thing to harm God's purposes for you. And then we're not going to dwell on it today, but we must give credit to David, because in this moment he welcomes her word with gratitude and with praise, and he calls off the hit on Nabal. And we must recognize that he could have, in pride, he could have rejected it, but he doesn't. He welcomes it with praise and with gratitude. So we conclude with these few things. Just a reflection. We said we'd shine a torch, but maybe if you are in conflict, may God give you the heart of Abigail. Or maybe God would send you an Abigail to help you in the midst of your conflict. And perhaps I could suggest for you, perhaps you could be aware if you are in environments when conflict arises. Perhaps God could use you to be an Abigail as you listen to this story. But our story ends where Abigail, after speaking this blessing over David, goes home. And when she tells her husband the story, once he's sobered up after his party the night before, and reminds him that he could have been killed, he has a heart attack, lingers for 10 days and dies. When David hears that Abigail is now widowed, he does as she had asked. He remembers her, and he marries her.